Hi, everyone. So this is our first meeting or sort of pre-meeting for group that's going to be starting reading Merleau Ponty's The Structure of Behavior. We're doing a pre-meeting where we're reading a paper about reflex theory because our plan for the book is that we will skip the fairly long chapter on reflex theory. Partly, I mean, we'll discuss this in our meeting today, but partly because reflex theory is not especially relevant anymore. It was popular in the early 20th century, but has sort of disappeared from physiology and psychology. Reading I think it's like about 50 pages long chapter about an obsolete physiology theory isn't like super interesting anymore. So we read this paper. So the paper is I had put the link in the server, but if anyone listening wants to follow along, it's by M. Thierry Muta. It appeared in Saint-Thaz in 2021. The title was Reflex Theory, Cautionary Tale, Misleading Simplicity in Early Neuroscience. And it's open access so anyone who, if you just search that title, you should be able to find the PDF and give it a read. We're doing things a little bit differently for this session because we're not going to read through the paper, page by page like we have been doing with Simondon. We asked people to pre-read the paper. I'm not sure how many people did that, but the idea is we're going to discuss the paper sort of more generally as opposed to just going through it page by page like we have been doing. Maybe I'll start with just like a quick summary of what the paper is about and what the reflex theory was, or I guess is to some extent. The reflex theory was a theory in physiology and psychology. It had to do with essentially what is the most basic element of behavior of an organism. And this includes invertebrates, mammals, birds, human beings in particular. So any living organism was supposed to their behavior was supposed to be explained in terms of this reflex theory. And so this theory has to do with, I think most of us are familiar with the concept of a reflex. So like the sort of classic example is when you go to the doctor's office and they take a little hammer and tap your knee, then your leg sort of kicks out or lifts up, automatically. It's something you don't have to think about or try to do. It just happens. And it's even actually hard to prevent your knee from doing it if you are struck in that particular place. And there are other sort of examples of reflexes, like one that we probably are not even aware of is that if you are like in a dark room and someone turns on the light, or you step into an illuminated room, your muscles in your eye or around your eye contract the iris. So like your eye contracts to let less light in. So when you're in a dark room, the muscles relax and more light is allowed into your eye. And then when you're in a bright setting, the muscles contract to allow less light in. And so this is something that, again, we're probably not even really aware of, but it happens sort of automatically just based on the amount of light that our eyes are exposed to. So the idea of the reflex theory was that essentially all behavior is built up out of these types of automatic reactions. So these are like the most simple forms, but then there's like more complicated forms that are composed of multiple different reflexes, all sort of added on to each other. One of the sort of key developments in reflex theory was Pavlov, the famous experiments that he did with dogs, where he introduced. So as a result of these experiments, he developed what he called conditioned reflex, this notion of a conditioned response. So there are certain reflex responses that are innate. So, for example, dogs will salivate if they smell food. So this is something that, or it's unlearned in the sense that dogs don't have to learn how to do this. They don't have to, learn how to salivate when they smell food. But then in his experiments, Pavlov would bring food to the dogs and ring a bell at the same time, or just before. I can't remember exactly what order he did it. But in any case, there was this association of the bell ringing and bringing the food. And so dogs that had not been exposed to this association, of course, when you ring a bell, nothing particular happens. They don't start salivating. But then these dogs that had experienced this pairing of the bell and the food, when after a certain number of repetitions of this pairing, when you ring the bell, they start salivating even if you don't bring the food. So what has happened, sort of as Pavlov understands it, is the unconditioned response, the salivation in response to food, the smell of food. This has been sort of transferred onto this conditioned response. So the dog has learned to associate the sound of the bell with food, and responds to the sound of the bell the way that it used to respond to the smell of food. And for Pavlov, essentially all behavior is no matter how complex, even human behavior that I don't know, proving a mathematical theorem or writing a symphony or a novel or whatever. All of these very complex behaviors are essentially built up out of these obviously much more complicated, but essentially the same process of association of one stimulus with a response, and then developing a new. Yeah, exactly. There's no mental life beyond an aggregate of simple reflexes. That's a good summary. So everything that our behavior and human behavior, all other animal behavior is just this very complicated interaction of many reflexes, all sort of built up on top of each other. And for us, so in the paper, he talks about how this, like, if we think about it today from our perspective in the 21st century, this seems like super implausible. It's like the idea that you could explain like how someone writes a novel in terms of like, ringing a bell and making a dog salivate seems like very absurd. But in the early 20th century, this was actually one of the predominant theories in psychology and physiology. Many important scientists, I think Sherrington may have won the Nobel Prize if I remember correctly, but and he was a partisan of the reflex theory, though he was somewhat different from Pavlov as is described in this paper. But yeah, so many prominent scientists, including people that were, at the forefront of research at the time, were partisans of the reflex theory. And so part of what this paper wants to do is to talk about, why that was. Why is it the case that a theory that today seems implausible and overly simplistic was taken seriously and sort of part of the mainstream of scientific research in the early 20th century. And so in connection with this, the author talks about the role of simplification in science. And this is something that in philosophy of science has been discussed quite a bit because, of course, any type of science, you have to simplify things in some way. You can't just say everything is complicated and interacts with everything else, and that's your explanation. If you want to explain anything or build technical apparatus of some kind, you have to simplify things, isolate something from something else, record an effect in separation from other effects that would mask it, and so on. You have to simplify in one way or another. But the question is, when are those simplifications useful or valid? Like, when is it that you're producing something that is good science by doing a simplification? And then when are these simplifications oversimplifications? When is it that your sort of attempt to simplify things is actually leaving out something important and not producing good science? And this is a very difficult question to actually, try to come up with an answer for. There's no sort of easy criterion you can apply and say that this kind of simplification is good and this kind of simplification is bad. It seems to depend a lot on what domain you're talking about, how exactly that simplification is applied, and so on. And so the paper talks about, so it gives sort of a summary of the reflex theory, similar to what I have just done. But then it also talks about some of the critics in contemporary critics of the reflex theory. So people in the early 20th century who were critics of the reflex theory, and looks at some of the criticisms that they presented and considers how valid those criticisms were. Were these criticisms adequate? Did they actually point out real problems with the reflex theory? And also like how effective those criticisms were in the sense of, is it because of these criticisms that the reflex theory ended up becoming obsolete? And so it turns out that it's not so much because of these specific criticisms that the reflex theory became obsolete. So some of the criticisms had to do with, for example, with the artificiality of the results that the reflex theorists were proposing. So they would, like Pavlov, for example, describes how he, when he did his experiment on dogs, he had to make sure that they were completely isolated from each other, from influences of the environment. So he actually built a special laboratory to make sure that the dogs would not hear sounds coming from the street or see shadows of objects from outside through the window or anything like that. So they were supposed to be completely isolated from the outside world. And the idea was that you sort of isolate the reflexes in their like purest form by preventing the dog from having any other influences coming from the rest of the world that would sort of mask the reflex, or that would make it more complicated to find what the reflex was. But of course, if you're thinking of like a goal of explaining dog behavior, like actual dogs in their normal life, this is a completely artificial type of environment. Most dogs are not raised in an environment that resembles this at all. Most dogs, grow up interacting with other dogs. They, have an environment that they, can explore, and different objects that they can interact with, and so on. The question is like, can you isolate a reflex in this very artificial environment and then sort of transfer your discoveries about that reflex to the case of the dog living in a natural environment? And a lot of the critics said, no, you can't. These reflexes are sort of an artificial product of the laboratory environment, and they don't actually tell us anything really about the behavior of organisms in their natural environment. And so like Goldstein, for example, who was another critic of the reflex theory, argued that essentially what these reflex theorists were doing was giving us information about human training of animals, but not about animals' behavior itself. So like you could, reflex theorists were able to study how animals react to rewards and punishments, and this is similar to the way that say a circus trainer would train an animal, but it doesn't actually correspond to anything in the normal life of an organism. So this line of criticism was influential within philosophy, but didn't actually have that much impact on the sort of scientific fortune of the theory. And one of the reasons for that, according to this paper, is that some of the proponents of the reflex theory, especially Watson and Skinner, had a very different conception of what science is about than Pavlov did. So for Pavlov, the reflexes are actual effects or properties of organisms. That reflexes are real entities that we're trying to discover as scientists. So the sort of realist ontology of reflexes. Whereas Watson and Skinner were positivists in the sense that for them, the question was not, what reflexes are there in this organism that we are trying to discover. The question was, what can we produce through experimental manipulations? And this is essentially a technical or engineering approach to science. So the idea is what you're doing in science is essentially trying to control aspects of nature. You produce a laboratory experimental system that is capable of bringing about certain effects, And that's essentially all that science is. You are not trying to discover something out there that exists prior to or independent of your experimental activity. You're just trying to bring about experimental effects. And so on this account, the question of like whether the reflexes are natural or whether there's any sort of transferability to natural behavior is sort of irrelevant. You like if you're Skinner, you're just taking your pigeons and trying to train them and seeing what you can do with training pigeons to respond in different ways to different types of stimulus. And the only thing that you're interested in is what you can actually get your pigeons to do and what they can learn. And so the question of whether these reflexes are real properties of pigeons is not something that he's interested in. And so this was, especially in the U.S., was a popular sort of philosophy of science for the reflex theory. But what ended up happening is that a lot of these experimental manipulations were pretty fragile, I guess you could say. So in the sense that, an effect that you produce in a laboratory depends a lot on the specific circumstances where, sometimes individual animals, for example, would just not, behave the way they're supposed to. The one animal learns the response that you had intended for them to learn, but then the other one is sort of resistant or gets bored or tries to escape or whatever. Animals are just not super reliable in producing the kinds of responses that you want them to. And then especially there were, I forget the names, but I think there were a couple students of Skinner who tried to sort of export this training system, this behaviorist training system outside the laboratory and do like demonstrations of, the behaviorist science applied to animals outside the laboratory. And it turned out that it was not that effective. And especially, right, yes, thanks, Spats, the Keller and Breland or Breland, I'm not sure. So what they found was that animals exhibited behavior that had not been trained. So what in certain schools is regarded as instinct. So like behavior that is characteristic of that species, they would exhibit it sort of in circumstances where the conditioned response was what the experimenters wanted them to exhibit. So you sort of train an animal to do X, but then it does Y instead, and Y is something that is more characteristic of that animal in its natural environment. And so the sort of behaviorist approach sort of treats an animal as like a blank slate that you can just build any sort of conditioned reflexes, conditioned responses onto, with an appropriate training system. But it turns out that animals actually exhibit a lot of behaviors that you don't train them for, and it's much harder to train them to perform certain behaviors than other behaviors, and so on. So they're definitely not just a blank slate that you can train to do anything. And so it's this sort of technical failure that seems to have been the main cause of the decline of the reflex theory. So they just weren't able to fulfill the promises that they had made of manipulating behavior in the way that they said they could. And this is also pretty important for human behavior because, like Skinner in particular, had some pretty horrifying ideas about applying behaviorism to humans. He thought that you could essentially just train humans the same way as you train a pigeon. It's all just a question of rewards and punishments that elicit conditioned responses in relation to stimuli. Fortunately, that was not sort of implemented the way that he thought it should be. But it also did have an impact on marketing. Like some of Skinner's students ended up going into marketing and trying to apply this type of work in marketing. So marketing, of course, works in ways that we often are not fully aware of. We, make associations between, I don't know, a logo, and this logo makes me think of quality, or this logo makes me think of, good value for money, or you develop these associations between a brand design, a logo, or a color, or whatever, and certain qualities of that product, but it's obviously not based on like a rational evaluation of whether that property is actually associated with that product. It's a conditioned response through being exposed to marketing of that product over many years. So marketing is the sort of the one field where some of these techniques are still around in obviously transformed form, but elsewhere. So in physiology and psychology, and then later cognitive science, when that sort of emerged as a discipline, the reflex theory was essentially replaced by computational approaches. So it's instead of trying to understand complex behavior in terms of these very simple reflexes, instead we try to understand behavior in terms of what kinds of computations are necessary to bring about that behavior, or to govern that behavior. And this is like a much more flexible paradigm. It allows for a lot more sophisticated forms of cognition to be understood. And also, just the fact that computers developed, very quickly over the course of the second half of the 20th century means that it allows for. You can sort of see a parallel between the development of computers as a technical apparatus and the interest in the computational model of cognition. As computers become more and more powerful, more and more dominant in our everyday life, it's much more. It seems more plausible to try to compare human cognition and animal cognition to computation. So that's sort of where the paper ends with. I think there's another paper by the same author about this computational theory, but I haven't read it yet. But yeah, that's sort of my summary of the idea of the reflex theory and what the paper talked about. I'm curious what other people might have thought about the paper, or if you have any questions about it. We can just have a sort of open discussion.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the most interesting things about this paper was that I studied briefly neurolinguistics when I was in university. And so we did go over Skinner and stuff like that, but we never really learned in depth about the paradigm of reflex theory and what it entailed. And so it's just kind of curious to read about something like this that nowadays seems to just simply not be mentioned at all, right? Unless you are looking into specifically into the history of the field. So that was for me kind of a surprise, I guess, to see how incredibly influential it had been, right? And then another thing that for me was really interesting about the paper was when the different, merits of the philosophical criticisms of reflex theory are being analyzed. This difference between science as a tool to discover nature as it is, or better comprehend nature, and science as a versus the more engineering approach where you're the one that was popular in America. When Skinner and so on are interested in trying to dominate nature, and so being able to produce certain effects. Well, it's an interesting shift in perspective, but it's kind of, I guess, for me, it's one of those questions where it's a bit difficult to see one without the other, or how would we be able to, control nature without understanding to some extent some of it, right? And then also, when we're trying to research the nature of things, we must be wary of, we do so through the methods of experimentation and so on, which will ultimately have their own, or that's a very big aspect of scientific exploration, right? And so those will have a very big impact on the results that we have. like there's always this question of whether the evidence that we are gathering is reflective of the way things actually are, or if they are reflective of the way we are, I guess, conceptualizing and trying to experiment, like of our experimental models, right? So I guess those two things were really interesting to me. On one hand, just kind of finding out that there was that much more depth to this little corner of now forgotten history of science, and then on the other hand, the way these different approaches to science could, to some extent, yield different, I guess, like different issues that would pop up, right? Like the role of abstractions is a bit different in a science that is more pragmatic, that is more focused on creating effects, right? Or something like that. Of course, if you're trying to discover the way things really are, whatever that means, any abstraction is gonna be some sort of problem or loss of whatever it is that you're abstracting away, right? But if you're trying to get certain effects, then well, that just doesn't necessarily matter that much. So I just thought that was a really interesting point that they made.
Yeah, thanks. Those are both really good points. The bit about Skinner and in connection with linguistics is interesting because one of Chomsky's first publications, and this is probably something you looked at, I would guess, was the review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior. And so Skinner, I mean, I only know this sort of secondhand. I haven't read the book itself, but as far as I understand, his approach to language was again in terms of condition responses. So essentially, the idea of what we learn as we learn a language is essentially how to respond to different utterances. So certain either you respond with another utterance or you respond with a certain behavior or whatever. So you have to learning a language means learning a set of conditioned responses to utterances, essentially. And so Chomsky's criticism, I can't remember if this is in that review or elsewhere, but he essentially points out the fact that language has this property of infinite productivity. So most sentences that someone utters in the course of a day or a month or whatever are sentences that have never been uttered before. But at the same time, it's most of the time people can understand what the sentence means. So you can produce infinitely many sentences, but at the same time, other people can understand those infinitely many sentences. So we have to. So you can't sort of treat language as this set of responses to stimuli because there's only finitely many sentences that we could ever have been exposed to in our period of learning the language. So instead, we have to think of language as involving rules that allow us to produce and then to decode or understand sentences. So these rules are computational rules. And Chomsky's approach to linguistics is one of the the generative program in linguistics is one of the sort of key pieces of the computational turn in psychology and the development of cognitive science. We model language on the idea of applying computational rules to produce some kind of output, as opposed to modeling language on a kind of stimulus response circuit. This has been obviously extremely influential. Pretty much all linguistics today is based on some either directly on the way that Chomsky proposed this understanding of computational rules, or it's in response to what Chomsky was doing. There are critics of Chomsky and other approaches to linguistics, but no one today holds anything like the behaviorist theory of stimulus response approaches to linguistics. So this was extremely influential. Pretty much set the tone for linguistics over the next 70 years. So like one of the founding documents of linguistics since the 50s has been a criticism of the sort of reflex theory approach to understanding language.
One of the interesting things about Chomsky's criticism, if you do read through it, is that it doesn't really go the way Merleau-Ponty or other philosophers or people quoted in this paper do. It doesn't really go over the issues that behavioral linguistics have, as much as Chomsky really just proposes an alternative, right? So he doesn't really say, okay, this is wrong because of this, and that. He does sort of make some arguments here and there, but they are really not the biggest part of his paper. But the interesting thing is that in this alternative that he proposes, you have, as you said, this computational way of understanding grammatical rules that we follow in language. And one of the interesting things about it too is that so the very big on one hand that was it spawned a very successful program of studying in the field of linguistics, as you said. So it was an idea that lent itself to research programs really naturally, I guess. And on the other hand, this way of understanding, at the very least, the semantic part of language, and specifically the way grammatical structures contribute to meaning of an utterance or a sentence. The kind of interesting thing is that the way it's done is itself by abstracting away and ignoring context to some degree, right? And then one of the main criticisms of that, which is found in pragmatics, is looking precisely at the way context sensitivity is related to understanding utterances. So it's kind of interesting that ultimately the way the whole thing would go on is still kind of similar to the different I guess debates that were had about reflex theory, right? Like the issues of how much modeling is too much modeling, how much abstraction is too much simplification, and so on, and how do we account for context, and how seriously should we take that context dependence, was something that was already relevant here, and it will still be relevant later on in this area of linguistics, which is getting a bit away from this paper, which doesn't go that much into that. But yeah, I just think it's interesting that it's the issues that are discussed here were always relevant, right? Even later on in this different field that spawned.
Yeah, I think you can see that sort of a pendulum swing, I guess, where in the behaviorist theory, it's as if context is the only thing that matters, the only thing that determines what sort of utterances and linguistic behavior people exhibit is whatever situations they have experienced in their lifespan. So the context is what determines your linguistic behavior, and that's it. And then the generativist paradigm in sort of broad terms, not just Chomsky, but other people who might criticize Chomsky on certain points, go sort of the other extreme and try to eliminate context as much as possible. Sorry, just let me type this. They try to eliminate context as much as possible. And so, for example, in semantics, like you mentioned, there's this idea or this concept of sentence meaning versus speaker's meaning. So, people can use a sentence to mean, just about anything, depending on what the context is. So, you can say, a type of example that you see often is someone might say, "The door is open," and this is an assertive sentence. It states a fact about the world, but in a particular context, that could actually mean "close the door." If you say it to someone that's in the room, for example. So you can use a sentence to mean lots of different things, but what you're trying to do in semantics is not so much study what you can do with a sentence, what you might mean by saying a sentence, but what does that sentence as such mean, independent of what anyone might intend to communicate by saying it. So you're abstracting from, the speaker context, intentions of the speaker and so on, and you're just studying this sentence as a sort of abstract entity and looking at, how the different parts contribute to the meaning of the whole. Um, yeah, and so like the issue of like abstraction and so yeah, it's a very different type of criticism. So when Chomsky criticizes Skinner, it's a very different type of criticism than Goldstein or Merleau-Ponty. And like Chomsky never brings up anything like the ecological validity of these reflexes. So that criticism that I mentioned, where these people, these critics in the early 20th century, had denied that the results of the reflex theory were applicable outside the laboratory. They treated them essentially as just artifacts of this artificial experimental situation. Chomsky doesn't make any similar criticism, and in fact, people have made similar types of criticisms of Chomsky himself and his approach to linguistics. Like, I mean, not to get into sort of too much about Chomsky, but like the generativist tradition is essentially based on judgments of well-formedness. So, as a linguist, you sort of come up with sentences and you sort of evaluate: is this a grammatical English sentence or a grammatical Arabic or Mandarin, whatever language you're studying, sentence, and then you try to produce a set of rules that will generate only the grammatical sentences and not the ungrammatical ones. And yeah, some critics have pointed out that this is a pretty artificial sort of approach to studying language, or at least it doesn't capture a lot of other aspects of language. Like, for one thing, you're sort of relying on the intuitions of a very small number of people who are not necessarily representative of the whole population, because these are people who have studied language and have particular theories about how language works. So you sort of you're just sort of taking this person, like their intuitions about grammaticality of sentences, and treating that in isolation and trying to predict the results of what those judgments will be. And so there are other approaches to linguistics that look more, for example, at the diversity of forms that occur within a population or a community. So in sociolinguistics, for example, you look at different grammatical constructions, for example, that compete with each other in some sense, that express something similar. And you might look at within a population, there may be stratification in terms of social class, or age or gender, etc., as to which constructions people use. People in this group might use construction A, and people in this other group might use construction B more often, etc. And so this is the whole aspect of language that is sort of left out of the picture in generative approaches to linguistics. And so you can make a similar sort of ecological criticism and say that, by studying language just in this sort of armchair way, by just sort of reflecting on whether this sentence is grammatical or not, you're not really capturing something that's very important about how language actually functions in real settings, in terms of people talking to each other and using language to do things. So yeah, the computational, and this is mentioned in the paper, this computational paradigm that is exemplified by Chomskyan linguistics, in some ways actually continues some of the sort of reductive strategies of the reflex theory, even though it is very different in terms of the actual content of what they're proposing. But it's still based on this idea of simplifying and sort of treating elements in abstraction, and then sort of building things up from those abstract elements. So it's in continuity with the reflex theory in certain respects. Another important criticism that is mentioned in this paper, so criticism that was proposed of the reflex theory at the time, so in the early 20th century, I guess up to World War II roughly, has to do with the sort of ad hoc nature of some of the theorizing of reflex theorists. So the reflex theorists recognized, of course, that most of the behavior that you observe in animals is not just in terms of straightforward observation, it doesn't match any simple reflex. So there, the couple of examples that I mentioned, the patellar reflex, where your leg lifts after you are struck on the kneecap, and the dilation and contraction of your iris. These are like sort of exceptional cases, and most animal behavior is very different from this. So even something relatively simple like walking, for example, this involves not just some sort of simple response to a stimulus, but involves coordination of 2 or 4 limbs. They have to move in a particular pattern so that the animal is balanced and moves forward. And also, it's also important that animals can adapt to a variety of different surfaces. Most animals don't live in a sort of laboratory environment with a perfectly level and smooth floor. They live in, I don't know, a forest or a swamp or whatever, where the surface that they're walking on is varies in terms of texture. They have to step over tree branches, etc. So yeah, animals exhibit coordinated movements that adapt to the environment in very complicated ways, and we see this, even today with like robots that are built to walk. They're obviously getting much better in the last few years, but still the problem of building a bipedal or quadrupedal robot that can walk on a variety of surfaces is like a pretty complicated problem. Whereas all sorts of animals are capable of performing this task without any like real problem. And so the idea, like the reflex theorists, sort of recognize this, but then they would come up with sort of so they recognize that the most animal behavior is not in some like directly observable sense a simple reflex, and then they would come up with these sort of hypotheses to explain this and say that, for example, you would like one reflex might be masked by another one. So like you might have a reflex that is exhibited by an animal in some situations, but then if you modify the situation in a particular way, then the reflex doesn't appear anymore. And so in this situation, you would say that reflex A is masked by reflex B. And so some of the critics of the reflex theory considered this to be a sort of ad hoc hypothesis. So you just presuppose that there are these things called reflexes, and then when you actually look at animal behavior and it doesn't match your reflex concept, you just say, oh, there's another reflex that's masking the reflex that we know is there, or that we think is there. And so this sort of ad hoc hypothesizing means that it's you can essentially just keep adding more masking reflexes and explain any behavior in terms of reflexes if you are sort of determined enough. You can just say, oh, this exhibits a reflex that is masked by this other reflex, and then this other reflex is masking the second one, and so on. You have like any number of reflexes all interacting and masking each other, and then it's not obvious that you're actually learning anything by talking about reflexes if the reflexes are never actually exhibited in directly in behavior. Auxiliary assumptions. And so there was this criticism of the sort of ad hoc postulation of ways of sort of solving the empirical difficulties of the reflex theory. And this is often this kind of addition of ad hoc hypotheses is often seen as like a sign of what's called a degenerate research program. This is I think Lakatosh, his term. It's the idea is that in a research program that is functioning well, you are continuing to make more discoveries, make more progress, etc. But then in certain periods of research, you find that you end up having to sort of make more and more ad hoc hypotheses to account for discrepancies or things that are hard to explain in terms of your theory and so on. And then this is a sign that the research program is not advancing, that it's not helping to advance our knowledge of the world. And so Popper, of course, is famous for this type of criticism. Yeah, but I mean, I don't think you have to sort of accept his whole philosophy of science to say that ad hoc hypotheses are generally a sign of, well, a weakness of a theory. But then, of course, the question is, in what conditions, like, what is it that makes a hypothesis ad hoc as opposed to a sort of a valid simplifying assumption? And this is like one of the key problems that this paper points towards, and doesn't offer a solution to it, but it does sort of point to the importance of this problem of when is it the case that our assumptions, even if they aren't true or even if they are sort of approximations, when is it the case that those assumptions are helping us to perform good science, and when is it the case that those assumptions are actually hindering our attempts to produce good science? So that's sort of like the bigger picture question here.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. 61 also mentioned now that it's an interesting open question of theory and language. To what extent theorization can or should be considered adaptable? And I agree. Another side to this, or another, I guess, element of these issues with ad hoc presuppositions is, I guess, a certain kind of fundamental pragmatic desire for, or I guess a desire for a theory of nature that would be more pragmatic, more easily useful, which, if we are thinking about science as something that has the aim, as an enterprise that has the aim of accurately describing the way things are to some extent, or something along those lines, then, well, maybe the way things are isn't really, the way things would be more easily used by us, or be more easily useful. So in this paper, it's said much better than what I'm saying it. It's basically one of the big presuppositions that went into, I guess, the motivation behind reflex theory in general was that it would be desirable to be able to explain complex phenomena in terms of simple parts being added, or interacting with one another in different ways and so on. And this is not only like a reflex theory thing. The analysis of analytic philosophy and so on refers to this process of breaking down something complex into its component parts, right? So this was definitely like something in the air in the early 20th century in general, in different areas of science. And here, when we get into these issues of the ad hoc justifications that we need to add to be able to basically excuse our theory of the experimental failures that happen, the empirical evidence that things are maybe a bit more complex or a bit different than what they would be if reflexes were indeed, the building blocks. It's like, oh, well, we get this experiment and turns out that they don't exhibit what we expected, and so, okay, there was an inhibitor, and then we do this other experiment and turns out that it was different, and so maybe there was an influence of this or that. Eventually, what comes to the question that comes to the fore is, well, are there even simple constituents, simple building blocks at all, when we aren't really capable of, finding them, except for the very specific experimental conditions that they appear in, and only in those. In the moment there is some variety, they just simply don't appear that much, and even then they have their own different varieties and different ways of changing. I think the example that they give is the reflex that dogs have, where if you tickle them or you scratch them in a specific spot, they will move their leg like automatically, as if they were scratching themselves. Even that reflex is something that it has been found to have a decent amount of variety when it comes to, like, in the same dog in different days, the zone, the strength of the tickling that you need to do, or scratching, those will change, right? They will differ. And so you are already not getting a picture that is as simple as, there's some stimulus that, or stimuli, or that gets our nervous system activated, and then we get a response from the nervous system into the muscles contracting or something like that, which would be the mechanical explanation that they were hoping to find, right? And so there is a really nice quote in the paper where basically it reverts the assumption that, or I guess the desire that maybe motivated this kind of research program, and basically says that I'm going to paraphrase it here because I I couldn't find it just now, but it's towards the end, where basically says that experimental data maybe shows us that what we find is not so much that complexity arises from simple processes, concatenated or arranged in different ways or so on, but rather that these simple processes arise from the complexity. It's what we get when we abstract from them or when we look at a very specific situation in an otherwise really complex system. And I just thought that was a really nice point.
Yeah, that's also important because I didn't talk about this element of Goldstein's approach as well, but he in particular argues that we should see the experimental setting of an animal, in the laboratory as a kind of pathological situation, and so it's like in the sort of direct sense that what we see exhibited by an animal in a laboratory when you deprive it of any contact with other animals and any stimulation from the outside world and so on is like a kind of disease phenomenon. It's not reflective of that animal as a healthy organism that is capable of functioning autonomously. And so for Goldstein, there's this conception of pathology or of what he calls a catastrophic response to a situation. So he was basing a lot of his ideas on his work with people who had suffered brain damage in the First World War. And so he points out that they might have sort of specific deficiencies as a result of specific injuries to specific regions of the brain. But at the same time, what happens a lot of the time if you try to get them to perform a certain task, it's not just that they have lost one specific skill, one specific ability to perform a certain type of task, but they like in that situation they just sort of collapse or something. They just are not like they're faced with a situation that they can't confront, and they just are sort of paralyzed. They can't really do anything. And so for Goldstein, these like experimental manipulations of animals are essentially bringing about this kind of catastrophic response in a lot of cases, where you sort of cut off the animal's possibility of acting on its environment, of exploring, of performing its behaviors in an autonomous way. And then the animal is sort of limited to this one very specific response. Is essentially all it can do is press a lever or run through a maze or whatever. And so this is a kind of this is a kind of experimental production of pathology as opposed to telling us anything about what an animal as an autonomous organism is capable of doing. And I think there's a lot of validity in that criticism, and I know that much more recently there's been like in animal psychology, there's been I think a turn towards more ecological validity in experimental settings. So you're still of course trying to control the environment in which the animals are raised and how they're learning and so on. But it's like we talked about this in one of the Simondon meetings. I can't remember which one a while ago, but like there's there have been results in earlier results in animal psychology saying that this type of animal is not capable of learning this type of behavior or performing this type of task in this setting or whatever. And it turns out a lot of the time the issue is not so much that the animal lacks the capacity to learn something; it's that the environment is not a good one for that animal. Like if you change the setting so that the animal is in a more sort of familiar environment or an environment that's more suitable for that type of animal, they are in fact capable of learning this complex task and performing sophisticated behaviors that adapt to changes in the environment and so on. So animals turn out to be much smarter in general than they were sort of thought to be when they were confined to these very artificial environments. And so, yeah, so this is a sort of very belated acknowledgement, I think, of some of the validity of Goldstein's points that when you isolate an animal from the kinds of environment that it would normally live in, you're not sort of just taking that animal and you're not just sort of getting the pure behavior of that animal. You're getting a very artificial product of a situation that is essentially pathological. So you're just sort of producing a diseased animal that is not capable of responding in the ways that a healthy animal is capable of responding. And so you're not really learning that much about how animals actually live in their normal life just by treating animals in isolation in these very artificial environments.
Yeah, I have some like examples that come to mind about this topic of like animals being, more intelligent in their own environment, so to speak. Just as a small tangent, because I think it's a very interesting one. So on one hand, the first one that came to mind was with rats. This was a study that was done some years ago that if you take like baby rats and you I think it was that you take them away from their mom for a bit and then you put them back in. Then what happens is that the mom will take extra care of those baby rats, right? And so it will basically groom them more and so on. And then as a result of that, the rats will actually have a more highly developed, brain capacities. And the interesting thing is that this is something that you can do over a bunch of generations, and eventually the rats that had this done to them, right? They were taken out for a bit and then put back in the cage, and their moms would groom them and so on. They would start to just do that naturally without having, like, maybe as a result of the higher, social, the aspect of the brain that I guess is correlated to social elements in rats was bigger, and maybe as a result of that they would just like naturally do that. And so that was a very surprising result, because it was, I guess, a non-genetic way of still changing future generations, right? But the interesting thing is, as a result of that, or in this way of experiments, different ways of trying to, I guess, expand the rat's brain capacities, where like it sort of exploded as a field of research. I think this was like in the late 90s, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm not like too sure on that. This is like a reference from Robert Sapolsky as well. So like there you can find the source in his lectures. But basically like the field exploded, and they were doing, I don't know, like playing games with rats and doing all sorts of stuff to like educate them. And it's so they would have these like amazing rats that compared to the regular laboratory rats, their brains were much bigger and so on. But then a study came out that compared them with like, and this was like a very big argument in favor of ethology. When you compare these like genius rats that have had the best rat education that science can bring, you compare them with like a regular rat that has like lived in a natural environment, so to speak, and they were like nothing compared to the brain size of the regular rats. And so this comes back to what you said earlier about how even something like motion in a laboratory setting where the floor is just completely plain and so on is nothing when it comes to complexity compared to the way real life quote unquote natural circumstances end up appearing, right? The other, and I'll make this one short, the other thing that comes to mind too is so with monkeys, and I guess with other animals, but with monkeys, a very interesting test that they do is called the dot test, which is you take a monkey, you put them in like a mirror, they can see themselves and so on, and then you anesthetize that monkey. You place like a red dot in their forehead or something like that. I think it's usually in the forehead. And then like the monkey wakes up and sees in the mirror image that there is a red dot. And so some monkey breeds will, or breeds, I don't know, how, like species, I guess, they will touch the dot or like examine it. And so this was taken as evidence. Oh, the mirror test, I see. Yeah, exactly. So this was taken as evidence that they understand that whatever is on the mirror is the reflection, right? Because they can like look at the dot and so on. So they can get the information that they have something placed on their head from the image of the mirror. So you have these like tiny monkeys, which are incredibly cute, from South America, and they are the ones that kind of look like squirrels a bit. And they didn't pass the mirror test, right? They wouldn't examine their thoughts and so on. And turns out that if you place the dot on their stomach instead of on their forehead, they would actually pass the mirror test. And so the main thing about it is in their society, or in these monkeys, the way they interact with one another, it's sort of like prohibited to look in the eyes, or that's like an act of aggression or something like that. It's not the way they would usually interact with one another. And so if you put, like, they would just simply naturally not look at their head in the reflection. But if you put the dot in like other places down below in the body, they would actually see it. And so that was an interesting case of, some earlier assumption made about the monkeys being challenged through knowledge that came from an exploration of the way those monkeys work in their own ecological needs, right? That's how we learned about their, I guess, social behaviors, and that's how we got the, I guess, improved mirror test that they do actually pass. And so now we know that they do actually have the capacity to understand that it's them in the mirror. They are just a bit shy, I guess, and they don't look at themselves in the eyes.
Yeah, those are both great examples. I know with the mirror test, I remember reading somewhere about elephants. Also, like earlier studies had shown elephants not being able to pass the mirror test, so they weren't able to recognize themselves in the mirror. But it turned out actually that later studies that used bigger mirrors were the elephants were able to pass the mirror test. So the problem wasn't that the elephant wasn't capable of recognizing itself in the mirror. It's just that the mirror was too small, so the picture, the reflection was like not was probably just a small part of the elephant, and so it didn't recognize itself from just seeing a piece of its forehead or whatever. Yeah, that's a very cute monkey. And then I've also read about dogs. So dogs don't pass the mirror test with a dot on their forehead, for example, like in terms of visual responses. They aren't able to recognize themselves in the mirror. And anyone who owns a dog has probably seen a dog like barking at themselves in the mirror and acting as if it's another dog in their house, which is always pretty funny. Um, um, but what there was another study where they did a sort of smell version of the mirror test. They took urine from a dog, from dog A and from dog B, and then they got dog A to sniff the different urine samples, and the dog is able to responds differently to its own urine sample compared to another dog's urine sample. So it's what exactly is recognizing is not obvious, but it is capable of recognizing that this is my smell and not someone else's smell. Um, uh, and this makes sense because dogs, of course, are much more olfactory than they are visual animals. Their whole sort of orientation to the environment is based around their sense of smell as opposed to their sense of sight. And so again, it's just like taking our assumption, like we are generally visual animals, and so we would sort of assume that this we just sort of transfer this onto other animals and say, oh, like this animal is not capable of passing the mirror test because it didn't recognize itself in the mirror. But then if you sort of think about, how does that animal, actually orient in its environment? What senses does it use to explore the world? You might actually look and try to adapt the test to that animal. And get something more interesting, where the animal is actually using the mode of exploration that it would normally use, and not one that is sort of an auxiliary method for it. So yeah, I think this in general is like a very interesting field of research. Like yeah, it's just like it's very difficult. Like animal psychology or studying animal behavior is much more difficult in certain ways than studying human behavior, because with humans you can always just tell them what to do and ask them what they saw and so on. You can just communicate with them directly. Whereas with animals, obviously you can't just directly communicate with them. You can't ask them, do you recognize yourself in the mirror? You have to develop these tests that try to elicit some sort of response from the animal, and then you also have to interpret what exactly it is that they're responding to. Like I think in some other tests, for example, like I think it was with dogs, they were trying to determine whether dogs could identify specific shapes. So like, could they be trained to always find the square as opposed to the triangle, in different orientations and so on. And in one study, they were able to produce this effect, but then at some point they realized that the dog was not learning squares. The dog was just recognizing that the square and the triangle in this setting had different surface areas. So like the portion of the screen that was colored was a different ratio if it was a square compared to a triangle. And so the dog was just essentially responding to how much of the screen is colored as opposed to what shape is displayed on the screen. So like you never know exactly what aspect of the situation an animal is responding to, and it might not be the one that seems obvious to us as humans. So yeah, like it's very difficult to find a way of controlling all these different circumstances in to isolate what exactly the animal is responding to. And so this, I mean, to come back to the paper a little bit, this I think speaks to the difficulty of like simplifying assumptions in the case of animal behavior in general, and then we can think especially of like sophisticated human behavior, and other animals, of course, exhibit sophisticated behavior of their own kinds. But like you might make an assumption that the dog is responding to the shape of the the square or the triangle, and you might not even sort of explicitly recognize this assumption. It might be something you just sort of assume without even realizing it. But on closer inspection, or as a result of examining the evidence for after many trials, you might determine that that is actually not the case. And so it's very difficult to like be able to identify that certain assumptions are valid or are useful in like simplifying the situation and extracting something valuable from the complexity of the behavior of the animal, whereas other assumptions are invalid. And a lot of the time you can only really figure out which assumptions are good and which ones are bad by like trying them out and conducting these experiments and being open to re-evaluating your assumptions as you go along. There's no sort of a priori way to like inspect an assumption and say this assumption is good or not.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the difficulty of, I guess, saying the Lakato's view of ad hoc assumptions being a symptom of a degenerative research program. That once again, maybe that's not quite so easy, or it's not so easy to recognize when we have that kind of assumption as a way of trying to save the theory from the data, or when we are trying to just simply refine our theory and find out more about it.
Yeah, and I know that like in philosophy of science, people have sort of responded to the Popper sort of falsification approach to scientific theorizing, and pointed out that pretty much every scientific theory is in fact falsified. Even something very simple like Galileo's law of of gravitation, or of free fall. The idea that bodies fall at the same velocity no matter how heavy they are. This is like empirically falsified. If you take a feather and a bowling ball, they will not fall at the same velocity. And of course, we would explain that in terms of air resistance and so on. And we would say that, and if you drop them in a vacuum, they will in fact fall at roughly the same velocity. But you like any sort of physical theory or chemical, biological, etc. Um, any of these theories are falsified in general, and you have to make like auxiliary hypotheses or assumptions and say bodies in free fall fall at the same velocity um, if they're in a vacuum, but not when they're affected by air resistance or other circumstances that might counteract the effect. So like you always have to add these. In philosophy of science, they're called ceteris paribus clauses. So all things being equal clauses. So you can say all things being equal, these two effects are the same. But in general, those all things are not equal. There's always background circumstances. Even a laboratory, you might have like vibration from a subway going by, or like electrical noise of some kind, or all sorts of things that just sort of interfere with the effect you're trying to find. And so you just have to like it's never, you can never sort of know from the outset whether these things are just noise that you can ignore, or whether they're important elements of the phenomenon you're trying to explain or understand. So all you can do is just try isolating things and see what happens, and then find out that maybe we are missing something important, and we have to include this other circumstance that we didn't try to include in the first place, and so on. So it's a much more difficult enterprise than maybe certain scientific theory or certain philosophy of science theories present, as if we can just sort of look at a theory and say this is like ad hoc, or this is a degenerate research program, or whatever. So it's much more experimental in the sense that you actually have to sort of try things and see what happens, and then be open to changing your conception of the world in sometimes radical ways, as a result of what you experience in your scientific journey.
Yeah, I think another example of what you said about things that might be interfering, and we sort of realized later on, and this is an example that I'm not like 100% sure of, but if I remember correctly, the way positrons were, I guess, theorized and discovered and so on, was that in many different experiments, they had actually been observed, but they had been ignored as just simply being like rogue electrons. That instead of going the regular way, they would go the opposite way, so to speak. So people were just thinking, oh, it's just a rogue electron passing, through the air at that moment of the experiment. And then eventually, as more and more experimental data came out, it sort of became obvious, I guess, that there were just too many of them. Like it would have been too much of a coincidence for something like this to happen with so much regularity. And so then, positrons and the whole, the antimatter things just kind of started to develop out of that observation. But it's an interesting thing because they were observed. Like you would expect something as mysterious as antimatter to be almost unobservable, and yet it came out of observation, right? Like observation came first, and then we realized that what we are observing was in fact this little thing that we are now theorizing.
Yeah, and it's important also to keep in mind that any scientific, like whenever you read a scientific paper or anything like that, it's always sort of a clean version of the data. Like sometimes you run an experiment, like a lot of times you will run something 10 or 100 or whatever times and then take an average. But sometimes you get like you might run it 100 times and get a result in a certain range, and then the 101st time you get a completely different result, like way outside the range that you established in the first 100, and then you might just say, okay, this is like an aberration, we're just going to throw out this result. Often you will do like you might repeat the tests a certain number of times, and then you throw out the highest and lowest values and then take the average, or something along those lines. Like you often, like the published results are always cleaned up in some sense. And that cleaning process, you can't sort of know at the outset that you're actually discarding something that is discardable. You might find out later that what you had treated as noise and something discardable is actually very important, and is sort of the key to understanding some phenomenon that you are trying to understand. And so, like, maybe another example that sort of fits with this is, I know, or something I read about, the discovery of pulsars. So pulsars are stars that emit radiation and rotate in a regular cycle. So what that means is that the star rotates, say, once every 10 seconds or whatever it is, and so the beam of radiation passing, coming from that star, fluctuates in a 10-second cycle. So every time a certain region of the star is facing towards the Earth, you get a beam of that radiation, and then when it turns away from the Earth, you don't get that radiation, so you get a 10-second cycle. And like in some of the early astronomical observations, like I think it was a researcher who like just sort of happened to notice, like, it's kind of funny that there's this noise that is like on a sort of regular. It looks like as if there's a regular pattern in this noise, and so someone else might just have not noticed it at all, or like taken it to just be a coincidence or whatever. But then this researcher sort of followed up and looked at other data and was able to sort of come up with an explanation of how this would come about, and that eventually leads to the notion of a pulsar. But yeah, so like other researchers might just have said this is noise, and we're just going to clean it up and delete this noise. But if you had done that, then you would not have been able to identify that there was such a thing as a pulsar. So yeah, it's you can never sort of know in advance what is noise and what is important signal that you want to keep.
Wait, is there a copy to the paper I could download somewhere?
Yeah, so if you go into the chat channel and just scroll up, actually, let me find it and post the link again. Just a
Yeah,
sec.
thanks. People have been typing, so it's like,
Yeah, I will post it again. Or did you? Oh, yeah, you just did it. Yeah, thanks.
thank you.
Yeah, so we just read the paper for today. We're going to move on to the book next time. But yeah, it's an interesting paper that gives some background that is helpful to the book, and it cites the book as well. It talks a little bit about Merleau-Ponty's criticisms of the reflex theory. So yeah, it's worth a read.
Oh, cool. What book are you reading next time?
So yeah, we're going to start on the structure of behavior, which is Merleau-Ponty's first book, before Phenomenology of Perception. So we're gonna I guess we can move on to like talking about next time, unless anyone else has any other comments about the paper that we want to go over. Okay, yeah. So yeah, for next time, yeah, let's read the book the same way that as we've been doing with the Simondon readings. Let's read through it in the session. So yeah, you can pre-read if you want. It's helpful, I think, to have an idea of what we're going to be discussing, but it's not 100% necessary. But yeah, so we'll start with the introduction of the book. So, or I think there might be a preface. I can't remember. But anyway, start with the beginning of the book, but then we will eventually, when we get to chapter 1, which is the chapter on reflex theory, we'll skip that chapter and continue with the rest of the book. So yeah, I think this time is the sort of best time that works for everyone. We have someone joining from Japan who's not here today, but he'll be here next week, most likely. So yeah, trying to find a time that works for people across like I think like 18-hour time zone differences is a little bit complicated. But yeah, so thanks everyone for your contributions. Thanks for coming out. And we'll start on the book next week.